So we have another major development in the legal battle over suppressors and the National Firearms Act. The Fifth Circuit has officially denied a rehearing en banc in a case called U.S. versus Comeau. That means that Comeau has effectively reached the end of the road when it comes to the Fifth Circuit, and the next potential step really is to just seek Supreme Court review. But there's another reason that this just became much more interesting. Since Comeau was originally decided, we got another massive ruling in the case Silencer Shop versus the ATF, where another federal court struck down major NFA registration requirements after Congress reduced the NFA tax to $0. So we now potentially have two different constitutional attacks on the NFA moving forward at the same time, but that Silencer Shop case and what is now developed also opens a weird can of worms. So let's break down what is happening and how the recent ruling in that Silencer Shop case may actually have opened that can of worms and may actually impact some of these suppressor lawsuits moving forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you like this type of content and you want to ensure that you get it going forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, if you carry a concealed weapon, I highly recommend AOR. They're the only program on the market that is entirely attorney-backed, that only does self-defense work. And also, they're always expanding upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. They just added in a training development policy within the membership. So you get online training through an amazing company, Achilles Heel Tactical, and you also get amazing discounts to go train with them in person. So if you're interested, check them out using the links down below and use my code ARMSCHOLAR when you sign up to get some money off of your sign-up fee. Now, in this case, the individual, Mr. Comeau, was prosecuted for possessing an unregistered suppressor in violation of the NFA. He challenged that prosecution under the Second Amendment, and when his case reached the Fifth Circuit, the court handed gun owners a very extremely important victory when it came to some language. The Fifth Circuit held that suppressors are in fact protected arms under the text of the Second Amendment. The court recognized that suppressors facilitate the use of firearms by reducing sound and muzzle blast and making firearms safer and more effective. But despite that conclusion when it came to the Second Amendment, the individual here, Mr. Comeau, still lost his case. Now the question is why? Well, that's because of an earlier Fifth Circuit ruling in a case called U.S. versus Peterson. In the Peterson case, the court essentially treated the NFA's registration process as it used to operate like a presumptively lawful shall issue permit. And under the Fifth Circuit's rule of orderliness, the Comeau panel here could not simply overturn that earlier ruling. So the court here was left in a very strange position. They found that suppressors are in fact protected arms, but Comeau's conviction for possessing an unregistered suppressor was still affirmed. So two judges on that panel actually wrote separately, wrote a concurrence criticizing the Peterson ruling and essentially saying that the full Fifth Circuit panel should reconsider this case and reconsider that ruling and take the case en banc. Mr. Comeau's attorneys sought en banc review in the Fifth Circuit, but now we have the answer from the Fifth Circuit. They have actually denied a rehearing en banc in this case. In fact, no judges actually requested a rehearing en banc. That means that Peterson and that ruling remains controlling precedent in the Fifth Circuit. But procedurally, it also means that Mr. Comeau can now take the next step and go directly to the United States Supreme Court. Now, there is obviously no guarantee that the Supreme Court would take up this case, but like I mentioned, there is now a critical circuit split on whether suppressors are protected arms at all. You have the Ninth Circuit that has said that suppressors are not protected arms, but now you have a Fifth Circuit ruling that says yes, they are. If suppressors are protected arms, their question is, can the government require Americans to register them without satisfying the historical analysis that is required by Bruin? And also, can courts simply presume that the NFA's registration system is constitutional by comparing it to an ordinary shall issue CCW permit system? Those questions were already important in this case. There was already a critical circuit split on whether suppressors are protected arms, but now something else has developed with a new ruling from a district court that is within the Fifth Circuit's jurisdiction. We just saw Judge Hendricks issue a massive ruling in the Silencer Shop case. However, I will note that the Silencer Shop case attacked the NFA completely on different grounds, and it was actually ruled on different grounds, not the Second Amendment issues. Comeau is fundamentally a 2A case, whereas the Silencer Shop case was actually ruled on based on congressional enumerated powers. In that recent ruling, Judge Hendricks concluded that once Congress eliminated the NFA tax on certain items, major portions of the registration system lost its constitutional foundation, and his permanent injunction has now gone into full effect for some people, some entities, some of those plaintiffs, and those individuals are protected by the judgment. So now think about this situation that we're currently in. We now have 3 different potential NFA regimes that can be enforced and maybe is being enforced. You have the old system with the old NFA, the $200 tax stamp, all of the registration requirements and enforcement components that are being applied against Mr. Camo, Mr. Peterson, and other individuals. Then you have that interim system that in some ways is also still being enforced in some states where you have no tax stamp, a $0 tax, but still all the NFA registration systems. And then you now have this new system that has come in with the silencer shop ruling where there is no tax, the elimination of the registration system based on the permanent injunction. And so again, like you can see, this is a very chaotic situation with 3 potential NFA regimes still being enforced. The Fifth Circuit has already said that suppressors are in fact protected arms in this case, but Camo's conviction remains intact because Peterson shields the old registration system from a full Bruin analysis because the Fifth Circuit said that the old NFA system operated like a shall issue permit. Meanwhile, Judge Hendricks has separately concluded that major parts of the current registration system cannot survive under Congress's taxing powers now that the tax is $0. In many ways, the claimed permit system that the court relied on as a justification to reach this Camo ruling and the Peterson ruling has now gone away. The new decision, however, does not suddenly mean Camo's conviction is invalid, but it does highlight why the Second Amendment question in the Camo case remains incredibly important. Judge Hendricks' ruling is tied to the $0 tax and congressional power. He did not address the 2A issue. He did not say that he didn't agree with the 2A issues. He just left those on the table because the plaintiffs already won on the taxing power questions. But a Supreme Court ruling under the Second Amendment could potentially do what the lower court, Judge Hendricks, did not do. Imagine the Supreme Court ultimately saying that suppressors are in fact protected arms and that the government cannot require Americans to register those arms unless it can demonstrate that its restriction is consistent with the nation's historical traditions of firearms regulations, which is the analysis required under Bruin. At that point, it wouldn't necessarily matter whether Congress changed the tax from $200 to potentially $20 or $0. The amount would not matter. The constitutional question would become whether the registration requirement itself complies with the Second Amendment. And this creates an incredibly unique situation because we again potentially have 3 different NFA regimes operating at the same time. Camo is facing a criminal conviction under the old system, the $200 tax, the registration, and the criminal penalties. Other Americans still may now be operating under the $0 tax, but continued registration systems. And people protected by Judge Hendricks' permanent injunction may now acquire or make covered firearms without the traditional NFA registration system or the approval requirements that Camo and Peterson were convicted under. That creates a bizarre posture for a potential Supreme Court case. Camo remains convicted for failing to register a suppressor under a system that no longer operates the way that it used to and which he was prosecuted under. That does not automatically invalidate this conviction, but combined with the Fifth Circuit now recognizing that suppressors are protected arms, this creates a very unique question for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will be asked in this case, was the old NFA registration system even constitutional under the Second Amendment in the first place? And, potentially what are the implications of now the new system that is impacting, how all of this was operating in the past? So now we're watching to see whether the individual here, Mr. Camo, files for a petition for Supreme Court review, a writ of cert, and how will these arguments form, especially based on all of the new developments surrounding the NFA. If cert petition is filed, if this has movement, I will let you guys know. But again, as you can see, when it comes to the NFA, a can of worms is now open. There are a lot of weird things going on. Prior cases are going to be impacted. There's been a lot of changes and developments. So if you want to continue to get information on all of this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on all notifications to not miss these videos when I release them. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.